we want to issue a special welcome not only from the Martin Luther King Center for Social Change, but from the City of Atlanta, the state of Georgia, the Southeast, and our nation, to some 50 senior state representatives who are in this assembly today. We welcome you. We thank you for joining us and participating. Let's welcome those senior representatives of their various states from around the world who are here in this sanctuary today. Some of them are standing. Those who are seated, would you please, those who are representing countries from around the world, would you please stand at this time? Dr. Whalum and the Ebenezer Choir. Since January the 11th, we have been celebrating the 50th. You can fulfill the dream. On yesterday, we had our annual meeting and our annual luncheon. Our president and chief executive of the center, Mrs. Coretta Scott King, gave her annual report, or began to give her annual report. And after she recorded the major events, halfway or a third of the way through her prepared report, she put it down and literally electrified a packed luncheon at one of our downtown hotels. I say to you, as I said to Coretta on yesterday, and that group that was assembled, she gave us an important and tremendous message. And that message contained a program not only for the Martin Luther King Center for Social Change, she gave us a program for all of America. It is my pleasure and honor to present to you Mrs. Coretta Scott King, the president of the Martin Luther King Center for Social Change. Coretta.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hill, Chairman of the Board of Directors of the Martin Luther King Center for Social Change, to our honoree, President Carter, Daddy King, Dr. Mays, to the members of the Board of Directors and Trustees of the Martin Luther King Center for Social Change, to our foreign visitors who have traveled so far to be with us in this, the 50th birthday anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr. We gather today here at the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church on one of the most significant, meaningful, and historic occasions in our long struggle for freedom, liberation, justice, equality, and peace. Little did we realize in 1955 in December, when we started the nonviolent crusade in Montgomery, Alabama, with Martin Luther King Jr. as its leading spokesperson, that 23 years later, we would feel deeply honored and privileged to give to the president, a Southerner, a white Southerner, the highest award that the institution for which Martin's legacy and his message is being perpetrated throughout this country and the world, that we would feel that he is the best person for this highest distinction. My friends, more than 10 years ago, Martin Luther King Jr. was locked in confrontation with three interrelated evils which plague the world: poverty, racism, and war. Today, that struggle goes forward, and among those in public life who are committed to the movement against poverty, racism, and war, few are giving greater leadership than the man we honor today, Amen. The 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter. Taking the helm of a nation that was spiritually bankrupt, threatened by political decadence, and a betrayal of the precepts of our great preamble and Constitution, in 2 years, you have begun to restore hope and confidence in our political and governmental processes by aggressively and courageously pursuing policies based on the needs and rights of all Americans. Mr. President, will you join me at the podium? And Mrs. Carter, will you come up and join me also? Mr. President, we at the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Social Change have observed your restless struggle, your relentless struggle against the trilogy of evils against which Martin Luther King Jr. waged such a mercilessly nonviolent war. Personally knowing the importance of economic freedom, you have fought adamantly for each American to have meaningful employment with a decent income and working conditions. To further ensure economic freedom and to honor a great American who throughout his public career worked for legislation that would help the poor and aid the oppressed and lift the downtrodden. You labored untiringly for passage of the Humphrey Hawkins Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act of 1978. In less than a quarter of a century, when it seemed that the evil force of racism would nullify the landmark decisions of 1954, 1964, and 1965, thereby transporting us to an era more degrading than the post-Reconstruction period. You spoke out for minorities in the Bakke case. In international affairs, in a world where a large majority of all people remain destitute and often without basic resources necessary for survival, President Carter is also providing imaginative and forceful leadership for the good of our own nation, as well as the advancement of global human progress. This leadership is based not on the arrogance of destructive power, but on a moral vision of a strong nation attempting to use its resources for the improvement of life for all people through peaceful ties among all nations. During so much of our lifetimes, we have witnessed years of tragic killings and destruction at the hands of American military power. But during the past biennium, no American soldiers have been required to shed their blood, and no American soldiers are killing their fellow human beings. We have at last begun to live in fellowship and cooperation with the great nations of the African continent. We have embarked on a mission of peace in the Middle East. We have engaged in negotiations toward a limitation and a later reversal of the arms race. We have worked more closely with our neighbors of the Caribbean area and Latin America. We have restored our friendship with the Chinese people, and we have caught the imagination and provoked the conscience of people everywhere with a human rights policy, a policy bravely proclaimed and steadfastly maintained by President Carter. Mr. President, as captain of the national ship, in changing times, you have held fast to unchanging principles and given to the nation and the world a new concept of leadership. As you have moved forward through the dangers, toils, and snares that would entrap a lesser man. Thus, on this road, where those of us who loved and revered Martin Luther King Jr. are walking, we are proud that Jimmy Carter, elected as our leader, walks with us as our brother. Therefore, Mr. President, on the occasion of the golden anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr., we present the highest award, the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Social Change Nonviolent Peace Prize to the President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, for your covenant of faith in the equality and goodness of all people, and for your spirited stewardship of a nation in search of universal justice and peace. Mr. President, this award carries with it this citation. You have to have a lot of hands, a check for $1,000, and a medal consisting of Martin's likeness. And I would like for Mrs. Carter now to join you on the other side to help you hold these awards.
Thank you, Coretta, very much.
Prime Minister Yolston, Foreign Minister Frydenlund, members of the diplomatic corps from throughout the world, Senator Talmadge, Congressman Levitas, my good friend and mentor, Dr. Benjamin Mays, my friend Daddy King, Coretta King, Chairman Jesse Hill, Reverend Dr. Roberts, ladies and gentlemen. I'm indeed glad to be back in this historic church where I have attended many inspirational and delightful services. I would say two or three things. First of all, I would like to donate this money, if Coretta has no objection, to the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Social Change, and I appreciate it very much. Coretta referred to things that don't change and the proper correlation of them with values which change. Today I had lunch with my own family, many of whom live in Georgia, my sons, my daughter, my 3 grandchildren. During lunch I held my new granddaughter Sarah. Daddy King, I looked at her very closely. She looks like me. I'm sure she's I'm sure she's authentic. It did take me a few minutes to get my suit clean before I could come to this meeting, but those kinds of close, personal, family relationships do not change. And the worldwide family that has already been described by Jesse Hill as a family of Martin Luther King Jr. changes only in its dynamic growth and inspiration, but its basic principles don't change. I've been president now almost exactly 2 years. I'm delighted to come back to Georgia. I was reading a 2-year analysis of my own personal character this morning in the newspaper. It reminded me somewhat of Daddy King. First of all, the commentator said I was getting older. He said I was getting grayer.
Amen.
He said I was getting wiser.
Amen.
And he said I was getting leaner. At least I heard 3 amens. I come here grateful, and I accept this award not as an honor that I have earned, but as an affirmation publicly that I share the hopes and dreams of Martin Luther King Jr., and I recognize the tremendous progress still left to be made. And together, you and I, millions of people around the world, will continue to make that progress, and we will also realize those hopes and dreams. Martin Luther King Jr. looked about him in his young life and saw great injustice. Many others before him had seen, and some, too few, had deplored racial prejudice, which resulted in deprivation of some and hatred among many. But for generations, little of that had changed. He looked about him and saw many of his own people who couldn't sit down at a lunch counter, who couldn't drink from a water fountain. Some of whom were afraid to register and to vote in the self-professed greatest democracy on earth. He saw a people without power or influence who were branded as inferior by both law and custom. But when he looked at his own people, he saw not powerlessness or weakness, he saw potential. And he believed in the great power of ordinary people who combine together to fight for what they know to be right. He showed all of us that we are not powerless if we care enough, and if we are willing to sacrifice enough, and if we are willing to risk public failure and disappointment and condemnation and criticism and sometimes humiliation, and if we're always ready to come back and fight again and try again. Martin remembered the words of Jesus. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And he was able to inspire the quiet and the timid folks by the truth of these words, proven by his own courageous actions. We remember him marching on as people spat on him, emerging triumphant time after time from jail, having defeated his enemies with his simple and his peaceful refusal either to stop what he was doing, to yield to pressure, or to descend to the violence of those who persecuted him. We remember him moving great crowds and even an entire nation with his eloquent words. But it's important for us to remember that he tasted defeat as well as he tasted victory. When he said, "How long, O Lord, how long?" it was not just a rhetorical flourish, it was an anguished cry of a heart that knew too much suffering in between those rare victories. He called out to the best in people, even those who looked the other way at the time. He called out the courage that many people did not know they had. He called upon their endurance and their patience and their simple goodness. He spoke of the America that had never been, but he spoke of the America that we hope in the future will be. We have survived as an increasingly free people now for 200 years, and we will prevail in the struggle for human rights because men and women like Daddy King, Martin Luther King Jr., Coretta King, Andy Young, and all those in the civil rights movement will never stop believing in the promise of our democracy, even in its darkest days, and others like me have learned from you. Together we will prevail.